So this girl, her name's Kara, and Kara is about to get kidnapped by a motherfucking serial killer. So one day, Kara had just stayed the night at her friend's house, and she's helping her friend with her chores, and she volunteers to go outside and water the plants. So Kara heads out to the front yard, she grabs the hose, and she starts watering all the flowers and bushes. And that is when she notices a car driving by. And it's no big deal, but then the same car drives by again, and it pulls into the driveway and it parks. And then a guy gets out, and he has a binder, and he's like, "Hello, are your parents around?" And Kara's like, this is my friend's house. And he's like, "Well, are your friend's parents home?" And Kara's like, "They're not home right now." And he's like, "Well, I'm giving out magazines. Would you mind giving these magazines to them?" And then he steps forward to hand her the magazines, and that is when, bam, he pulls out a pew-pew, and he points it at her. And he's like, "You're coming with me." And he grabs her, and he opens the door to his car, and there's a big plastic container in the back seat. And he points the pew-pew at her, and he's like, "Get in the container." And so she does. And he closes the lid, sealing her in. And then he gets in the car and he speeds away. And poor Kara, she's in this container and she's just panicking. About 10 minutes later, the car pulls over and the guy opens the container. And he ties Kara up and he makes her get back in. Then they drive a few more minutes before the car stops again. And it stops in the parking lot of an apartment complex. And the kidnapper, he gets out of the car and he picks up the container with Kara inside and he drags it into his apartment. A few minutes later, he opens it up, and Kara, she's still inside, and she's still tied up. So he lets her out, and then he sits down with her, and he starts asking her lots of questions and writing down the answers on a legal pad, like he's interviewing her. And he wants to know her full name, her address, the names and addresses of her friends. He wants to know about her boyfriend, her sexual history. It's weird. And once he's done with this weird-ass interview, he straight up threatens her. He's like, "Do everything I say, or there will be consequences." And then he reminds her that he has a pew-pew. And then, shortly after that, he unfortunately essays her multiple times. And now eventually, he tries to get Kara to eat something. But as you can imagine, she isn't very hungry. So she's like, "No thanks, but is there anything I can do for you to help you?" And the kidnapper's like, "Sure, you can sweep the kitchen floor." So Kara gets a broom and she goes to sweep the kidnapper's kitchen floor. Now, she doesn't really want to sweep this turd's kitchen floor. She wants to appease him so that he doesn't flip out and suddenly unalive her. And she also wants to learn as much information about him as she can. Because Kara plans on getting out of this one way or another, and she wants information to identify him. So she starts memorizing facts about the kidnapper. And while she's in his kitchen sweeping, she uses this opportunity to get close to the refrigerator. And pinned on that fridge are magnets for his doctor and his dentist. So she memorizes the names of his doctor and his dentist. And she just keeps on collecting more and more info on him. She strikes up a conversation with him and she learns that he was in the military. Specifically, he was discharged from the Navy. And at one point, she's in the bathroom and she finds a hairbrush with long red hair in it. She also finds feminine hygiene products. So she knows a woman with red hair probably also lives there with him. And she also sees that he has a pet guinea pig and a pet lizard, and she memorizes all of this information too. And then, finally, hours later, it's around 2 or 3 in the morning, and the kidnapper, he makes her take a Valium. And then he takes her and he handcuffs her to his bed and he restrains her right leg. And then he lays down next to her and he falls asleep. And that is when Kara is like, "All right, this is my chance to escape." But then the Valium starts kicking in and she's out. Hours later, Kara wakes up, and it's just starting to get light outside, and she's still handcuffed, and she's still tied up. And she looks over, and the kidnapper, he's still asleep. So she tries to slide her hands out of the handcuffs, but it's not working. They're on too tight. But then she notices the handcuffs are attached to a rope with a quick link, which is like one of those little link things. So as quietly as she can, she bites down on it and she clamps her teeth around the screw. And somehow she loosens it enough to slide the handcuffs out. Then she uses her free hands to disconnect her leg restraint, and silently she slides out of bed. And luckily the kidnapper, he's still asleep. So she tiptoes through the apartment, and then, bam, she runs out the front door and into the complex parking lot. And outside, there's a car driving by, and she runs straight toward it, and she waves her arms to flag it down, and the car, it stops, and the guys inside are like, "What the fuck is is this? And she's like, I was just kidnapped and I escaped. Take me to the police, please. So these guys, they drive her to the sheriff's department. And there, she's like telling the officers the whole story. And the deputy, he's like, okay, can you help us find this guy's apartment? And Kara's like, hell yes, I can. So they drive her back over to the apartment complex to try and find this apartment. Here's the problem with that. It's an apartment complex, so all the units look the same. And Kara, she doesn't know the exact unit, so they flag down the property manager of the complex. And the deputy asks Kara if there's anything she can remember about the guy that they can use to identify him. And Kara's like, yeah, and she tells them he lives in a bottom left unit, and she describes the guy, and she describes his car, and she says he's got a pet guinea pig and a pet lizard, and maybe he lives with a woman with long red hair. Everything she remembers. And the property manager's like, I think I know who this guy is. So then they take Kara to the hospital to get her checked out. Meanwhile, the police, they use all the information she has given them, like his doctor's name and his dentist's info and all of that stuff to find out exactly who this guy is. And this kidnapper ends up being this creep, Richard. Ex-military, total weirdo, lives in that apartment with his wife, who just happens to have long red hair. No idea where the wife is during all this. Now, of course, by the time police go to Richard's apartment, he's no longer there. He fled. But they search the place and they find a footlocker. And this footlocker has some newspaper clippings in it about 3 unalivings that happened in another state. And police, they put 2 and 2 together and they realize Richard was responsible for these other unalivings, making him a serial killer. Meaning Kara legit just escaped from a f***ing serial killer. 2 days later, police actually track Richard down. He's been staying in a hotel in Florida. But by the time they get there, he's gone. He fled again. But shortly after that, police actually spot him driving. And they try to pull him over, and he's like, "F you, you'll never get me." And he speeds away, and then this whole thing turns into like this massive high-speed chase. So Richard's driving, and he's trying to get away, and police, they go and they throw down one of those spike strip things to puncture his tires. And he runs over the spike strip thing, and then pow, his tires pop. And then kaboom, he crashes his car. And police, they got him surrounded. And they're like, "We're sending in a canine unit." And so they send in a canine dog to attack him. And the dog rushes in and it bites Richard because he's a good dog. And then Richard, he suddenly pulls out a pew-pew and he unalives himself. And interestingly enough, Kara, she eventually ends up getting her life together and healing. And she actually goes on to work in law enforcement, specifically for the sheriff's department that was working on her case. And she got to work on cases of SA and abuse, and she gets to help other survivors like her. And today, she's still thriving. She has a true crime podcast, and she's got a pretty popular TikTok account. So, good for her.